Autism is really one of many disorders that fall under the heading pervasive developmental disorder or autism spectrum disorders. And all of these disorders have in common features of impairment in social interaction, communication, and behavior. When you hear the term autism spectrum disorder, the term is being used to refer to multiple disorders, specifically autism, Asperger's syndrome, Rett syndrome, childhood disintegrated disorder, and pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, which means I have some but not all of the features of one of the other disorders. So it's 5 disorders. But autism spectrum disorder can also refer to the continuum of involvement within the diagnosis of autism, meaning that some individuals with autism can be quite impaired and some individuals with autism can be very mildly impaired. So in a young child, in a 2 or 3-year-old, I think it's impossible to predict what the future holds for that child or what this diagnosis means. There's a range of involvement that the child might have as they get older. They might be a child who's very verbal, very fluent, very intelligent, learning in school, and for practical purposes indistinguishable from their peer group. Or they could be a child at the other extreme end who remains completely nonverbal, is severely cognitively impaired, has severe developmental disability and lifelong dependency on outside help and support. And then there's everything in between. And that's the mystery of this diagnosis. We don't know why some children progress to the point where they are indistinguishable from their peers, and why some children with access to the same intervention therapy and support, or maybe even more intervention therapy and support, don't make the same gains or have the same rate of progress and continue to have significant impairment.
It's an unusual world. It's a world that parallels in important ways what a small, very small child experiences. The world for children like Jack begins very close to the body and does not extend from the body in the way it does for typical kids. Many children with autism, for example, literally do not know what they are seeing. They cannot spot an object that's 20, 30 feet away from their bodies. The object does not have meaning. For many of the children, the objects only have meaning when they're directly, physically involved with it. So a cup has meaning as they hold the cup or as they drink from it. But if you put the cup upside down, it might lose all its significance. Many of these kids have the need, for example, when they go into new space, to define that space for themselves by running back and forth, and in that way establishing for themselves the reality of the space that they're in. Only gradually, as they start to develop, does space become defined for them in a way that allows them to leave a familiar place and come back to it again. Another striking thing has to do with the way in which they process information. Their sensory systems do not work the way the sensory systems of typical kids do. Most of them have some problem tying in audition, what they hear, with what they see. The two are somehow disconnected. And also disconnected is the impulses or the feedback that comes from moving their bodies. And so they lack a solid basis for developing a sense of their own physical being. Now, given those two facts, it becomes important to find ways to enhance the experience of the body and to find strategies that will allow children to move from place to place and to begin to process the world in the way that other kids do.
Sit on it like a horse.
It's generally accepted that early and intensive intervention has a significant impact on outcome, and that we can significantly improve prognosis or outcome if children are started in intervention at a young age, and if that intervention is intensive. That doesn't say which type of intervention it is, but that it is intensive, that they get a lot of it. So that we know that that can bode well for prognosis. But beyond that, it can be very difficult to look at a child at 2 or 3 and say, we know you're going to have a good outcome. Now, in a young child, in a 2 or 3-year-old, if they're already very verbal and have gained language, and if they're using language for functional purposes, they're not just saying things, but they're saying things with intent to communicate to somebody else, then that child is a child who tends to do better. We know that if we get to see early evidence of joint attention, the child who is seeking out the attention of other people, I need your attention to what I'm doing, I need you to be aware that I'm doing something, then that's a child who can tend to do, who seems to do better, who seems to do well. But beyond that, there are factors over which we have poor understanding or no control. There are genetic factors probably. The difference in outcome also speaks to these varying phenotypes, or the different types of autism. Autism being one word that describes probably many, many different types of children, and we have a very poor understanding of why that is, why there's so much variability amongst individuals, all of whom have autism.
Jack, why do you think the word autism scares so many people? Hey!
The term literally means self-involvement or locked into one's own experience. The term is scary because until fairly recently, it was felt that these children had a very poor prognosis. For many years, children with this diagnosis were institutionalized, or even prior to that, they're confused with retardation, and to this day, there is still a problem of differential diagnosis between children who are basically retarded and secondarily autistic versus those who have normal capacity but are autistic. That's still a tricky differential diagnosis for some kids. Parents have been concerned in large part because of the literature. The literature indicated that few, if any, marry in the future. Relatively few were gainfully employed. Those people who went into the literature up to fairly recently were terribly depressed and disheartened.
For parents of very young children, there's a very painful, active grieving process that's going on, and it will continue to go on through that child's life. And that's, to me, to be expected and normal, and I wouldn't expect anything different of a parent of a young, newly diagnosed child. And it is amazing to see how parents transform over time, and how a parent's transformation in their hopes and expectations and wishes for their child, how that influences, I believe, their child's progress and outcome, and how, you know, of course, it all starts with a family and with a parent, and how they accept their child as who they are, especially as time passes. It's different for every family, and that's what's so amazing working in this field, is to see how each family deals with change and with progress and with the passage of time, and possibly with re-grieving when the child has not met a goal or an expectation, or a certain period of time has passed, an age at which we're painfully reminded that our child isn't going to kindergarten just like his peers might be, or going to the prom, or learning to drive. But again, it's fascinating to see how different parents integrate all those feelings and then come to a point where it doesn't matter anymore. It's my child, they're who they are, and I wouldn't change anything about them now that we've been on this journey together.